Welcome to The Leaders Who Care, a podcast powered by Dynamis Group. We are here to give the stage and support to those committed to create a positive and lasting impact, way beyond the profits and margins, the leaders of the world who care for others and serve a bigger purpose. Join us on the journey of creating a better, more caring world. And now to your host, Stoyan Yankov.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Leaders Who Care, episode 68. And I'm very, very honored and humbled to be here with Estelle Morrison. She's a registered psychotherapist. And what a better person to bring on board and to hear some insights and some tools and ideas from in these very, very uncertain times. And talking about uncertain times, it's not something from yesterday, unfortunately. The last couple of years have been such an interesting time, as we were discussing with Estelle in the background. Very, very interesting time. But welcome, Estelle. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
How are you feeling this morning?
Feeling great, listening to the hail hit against my window and kind of a dark, gloomy day, but looking forward to brightening it up somehow and having a great discussion with you.
And maybe let's start from there. What do you do on a dark, gloomy day so you can get the best out of it?
Well, for me, it means balance. It means moving, not sitting in front of the computer 24/7 and staying stuck. It means talking to people, having great conversations, always trying to inject some kind of laughter, some kind of play in my day, because, you really need to brighten it up when it does look like it does in Toronto outside. And really trying to have that balance, as I said, not that it's kind of sitting in one position, staring at a screen for the entire day.
And just so we can give a little bit of a context for the audience, could you maybe give us a glimpse of your background, your professional journey? What excited you to start doing what you're doing today?
So I have a bit of a unique background in that I have both a mental health care background and a business background. So I have had a career for over 25 years that has embraced both corporate culture and mental health. And so I'm a registered psychotherapist. I've been practicing, as I said, for over 25 years without dating myself too much. And I've been really fortunate to work in organizational environments, big and small, servicing the employees and the leaders with mental health care services. So I've also had a career from my 20s that has involved leadership. So from the very start, I was kind of in the right place at the right time. And I went from being a frontline worker to a director in my 20s. And so I've had this really incredible journey of working for all kinds of organizations, talking to all kinds of leaders and employees alike, and really being able to gather those experiences and try to learn from them as a person, as a leader myself, and as a mental health care provider. So throughout that career, I've also worked as a psychotherapist offering direct services. So it's been this interesting mix, interesting for me, I hope interesting for the people that I've served. And I'm really humbled by it. It's been quite the experience and quite the learning and growth opportunity.
And where is this fire coming from? I can see it in your eyes, even by you speaking. And I'm sure the audience can also kind of feel it. You're so excited and passionate about it. Where is this fire coming from?
So, every day I try to wake up and say, there's all these things happening around us. We were talking backstage prior to the start of this broadcast, and you kind of look at all the things going on, and you can so easily feel disgruntled, flat, Why bother? What I do doesn't make a difference. And it can feel that way sometimes when you're sort of focusing on little elements of what does my contribution matter? How does it matter when the world is so big and so much in need? And instead, I try to approach it from a what can I do? And how can I influence other people? So that, sort of pay it forward experience where my influence to you might make a little difference. You then influence other people, that might make a difference, and so on. And I think if we all focus on our circle of concern, our circle, as Stephen Covey would say, what's our area of influence? I think we really can make a difference. And so I get excited by that because I try to focus my energy on how can I engage people, other people, in a way that matters. So that's kind of what lights my fire. And it lights my fire as a psychotherapist when I work with people and people come to me in a way that feels delusioned, and what can I do and how can I engage in my life when I feel this way? So I approach those situations from how can I help them connect to themselves better? How can I help them re-engage? And then I think of larger groups, larger organizations, larger areas of influence. So it's all really exciting to me to think of my ability to influence that in a positive way.
And thank you so much, Estelle, for doing this work and supporting people in these very, very turbulent and uncertain times. And once again, this is such an important note. I hope you guys who are listening really grasp this. And this is the point of, in times of uncertainty, in times of very difficult and turbulent times, it's very easy to lose perspective. And what Estelle is mentioning here is we need to get back to the core. What are the things that are within my control? Obviously, there's many things that are beyond our control, and we can never impact them in any way. But we still can make a difference. Everybody can make a difference, and this is where we can kind of shift this sense of hopelessness, I would
Yes.
guess.
Yes.
And Estelle, if maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. You've been working with many leaders, with many individuals in the last couple of years. As we mentioned a couple of times already, very uncertain times, working from home, pandemic. Currently, this is March 23rd, 2022, when we're recording the podcast. Ukraine is in a war with Russia. There's a lot of uncertainty going on around the world. How do we find this peace? How do we find this calmness in the midst of a crisis?
Right. It's such a good question. And I think, from a mental health perspective, it's certainly what's affecting so many people today. It's, that sense of how much more can we take? All these terrible things are happening. And I hear some people come from a place of, how can I change this? This is so awful. I wake up every day and I look at the news and I think of isolation and I think of the impact of the pandemic and, what matters anymore? Why bother? That feeling of hopelessness that you describe. And, it all starts with small bits. And the way that I like to think of it is I call it big picture, little picture. And what I mean by that is, use your perspective to drive change. And so when I am feeling overwhelmed by big picture, and so big picture is COVID and the war and the economy and the fear of the future and, why bother and global warming. And you kind of do big picture and you feel completely helpless. You then zero in on little picture. What can I do today? What are the pieces I can focus on just for today that helps me engage in a more positive way, that helps me feel like I'm doing something that matters? And then when you feel stuck in the small minutia, you say, let's look at big picture. Big picture is we're going to help get through this. We're going to help people, support people to get through this, to create meaning again. to re-engage. And so shifting perspectives, I think, can be really helpful, whether it's moving to that big picture or focusing on the small picture, to help motivate people and inspire people to move forward. The other thing that I would say that's really critical, I think, as a leader and as an employee, is to say, how do I inspire other people? How can I be a role model? And role modeling doesn't mean, social media perfection, everything is fantastic. I think we need to stop promoting images, whether it's a LinkedIn, life is wonderful, everything's perfect kind of scenario, or Insta or Facebook or any other social media site, is to focus on reality, is to focus on people that move through challenge, that deal with real life on real life terms, but find a way to engage and to feel motivated and inspired. So I'd like to get rid of this inauthentic image of how people live, because that's not how real people live. Real people have low mood and anxiety and fear and frustration, but they find a way to re-engage and connect. And that's what I want all of us to promote, is authenticity, inspiration, motivation for real life issues.
This is such a relevant, such an important point. Finding strength to tell the truth. And I
Yes.
think that's what some leaders have been failing with, trying to make things sound positive, but not really telling the whole truth. And in such periods, it might be that it's a really difficult situation. I mean, imagine you are having a business in Ukraine. Imagine you are living in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't go and say, well, it's a great day, it's going to be fine.
Right.
Probably that's not the way to go about it. So you have to recognize, as a leader, it's difficult time, but hey, let's come together. Let's focus on what can we control,
That's right.
and create this certainty and peace in the midst of the difficulty, trying to seek for solutions, like switch on to solution mode as opposed to freeze. And I gotta say, Estelle, the first couple of days when the war started in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
I was personally so anxious.
Yes.
Literally, my body, I was, it was too much. You
Mm-hmm.
read the news, you talk to people, and part of the anxiety was coming out of, how can I be the best leader I can be? How can
Yes.
I support my friends in Ukraine? How can I be there for my team? And I was feeling this huge sense of guilt,
Mm.
that maybe I'm not doing enough, and kept on reading news, and my anxiety was going to a really, really um, high space.
Yeah.
So I wonder, what would be your advice to leaders in terms of self-care, especially in situation like this, because leaders are the ones that need to lead others through these difficult times, but they need to take care of themselves first. So what would be your advice to leaders in terms of self-care?
So it's interesting because, you know, historically, I think leaders would be this icon of strength and, nothing affects me. I'm kind of impenetrable. Nothing really bothers me. I just keep going. So should you. And I think, people don't identify with someone who just sails through tragedy or difficult circumstances. I think the first thing I would say is that it's okay as a leader to acknowledge you have feelings too. You get anxious also. You're reacting to the war and the pandemic and all the limitations as well. And as you said, Stoyan, it's also about saying, but we need to come together. And so despite these feelings, despite what's going on, we need to find a way to inspire each other and to move forward. So number one is to be authentic, right? People don't identify, especially in this day, with people that portray this kind of, nothing bothers me image. It's not something that people identify with. So the first thing is to know that you as a leader will have fears and anxiety and low mood and frustration and worry about the future, just like everybody else. And in some ways more so. because the things that are affecting us today aren't unique to employees. So historically, employees might have worried about downsizing or right sizing, or is there going to be a reorg and am I going to have a job? When you talk about the war and you talk about the pandemic, it affects leaders in the same way, except they have a double role. They have their personal response and they have the responsibility of their employees. And so, and the business, of course. So there's almost this double pressure and a more pressing urge and immediacy to take care of themselves in that. Historically, leaders would be the last to sign up for some mental health program or mental health improvement because they'd be, that's for my employees, that's not for me. And I've been privy to, sort of executive coaching that would actually turn into a mental health support, but leaders were less inclined to identify as needing a mental health support. So they might sign up for executive coaching because that sounded better and it had that sexier, kind of title, but really was very much about having needs like every other human being. So I think self-care starts with recognizing you are no different than your employees. You will react to trauma. You will react to all of the things going on in the world. You have maybe additional pressures. And until you recognize those and recognize your need as a human being, you're not going to be able to support others. So I have seen people, again, carry the banner and the poster, but not do the work from within. And so we owe it to the people that we work with to do our own work, to recognize our own needs first. And if you think of, being on an airplane, I don't know the last time, Stoyan, you were on an airplane, but if you remember, okay. So for a lot of us, we haven't been there in a while, but the first thing they say is if you're looking after someone, if the oxygen mask comes down, you put your mask on first. And as a parent, or a caregiver, you might think that's horrible. Why would I, how could I leave my child and not put their mask on first? Well, the truth is, if you don't take care of yourself, you're no good to anybody else, right? And the same is true for a leader. If you don't address your own needs, believe me, it comes out. And I've been privy to those conversations that employees have about leadership, about, after a town hall meeting, there's a lot of buzz and there's a lot of talk. People notice when someone is inauthentic, when someone doesn't show up in a real way. And so you may think that not taking care of yourself, you can get by, you're resilient. Trust me, it will show. And so the things that leaders need to be mindful of is their own mental health. Who are the supports they have in their life to address those fears, to address those anxieties? Where do they go? How do they get expressed? Where do they come from? I would say, constant reminders of why you are where you are. What is your circle of influence? Who can you impact and how? Trying to gain more control is often a response. It's like a knee-jerk reaction that many leaders have when they feel out of control. So they try to over-control the things they can. And I would say over-control in that way can be a disaster. So instead look for things like inspiration, like engagement, showing that you care and that you can relate to people. I can't tell you how important that is. I remember some time ago, I worked in a call center. I was a leader in a call center, and there were some crises. There were things that we would do as frontline people when the phone started ringing in a mental health call center. The phones would ring off the hook if there was a world crisis or global crisis. And I remember once we couldn't answer the phones quick enough. There were, the phones were ringing off the hook. And as leaders, we decided to get on the phones ourselves. And the message that sent, and it was a hierarchical environment, so that wasn't necessarily, a good thing to do from an executive perspective. But what we did was we joined forces with the frontline workers, and I can't tell you what that did for them. They felt like they weren't alone, like we were in it with them, and it was what we could do. So we couldn't fix the global crisis, but we could show our team that we were in it with them, that they weren't alone. And so as a leader, I think it's constantly asking yourself, what can you do? What can't you do? I think general self-care, people forget that, I used to work as a health coach. And if you look at data today and you go all the way back 30 years, it hasn't changed much. The same things around self-care are important. Exercise, eating right, sleeping right, having a great social network, feeling like what you do matters, feeling the importance of what you can contribute, dealing with emotional overload, right? Those are the same things that have been true for years. They're true today. And they're super important for leaders that are taxed in so many ways to disengage, to shut off, and to say, now it's time to get balance and to take care and put back into the bank, so to speak.
Thank you so much for sharing all this. And I actually want to turn it around a little bit with a little bit of a role play, so to say. Let's imagine that you are leader of a large organization, executive. You have a large team, and it's a major event happens. Let's say it's the first day of the war in Ukraine. Everybody's very anxious. There's a lot of stress and uncertainty. Imagine you in this situation. What would be your step-by-step kind of approach towards taking care of yourself, but also making sure that those around you are also well taken care of?
So the first thing I would say is communication is critical. What we often do in those times is we isolate, right? So if I'm not feeling great or I'm feeling worried, I might remove myself from other people. And I think as a leader, knowing that what you're feeling is very likely what the employees that you work with are feeling. I think often people wait too long to communicate. And I've seen in large organizations this templated email that goes out, right? Saying many of us are, it kind of has that language that is so templated and not personal. And I would say, start with getting in touch with yourself first. What am I feeling? What am I experiencing? What are my fears? And then try to jump into the shoes of the people you work with. What might it feel like for them? They might have relatives, they might have friends, they might just be reading the news too much and become immobilized. So how can I connect with those feelings? How can I support them? How can I let them know what resources are available to support them? And how can I use those resources for myself? Right? So it's not a them, take care of them, and then I'll figure out me after. It's I've got to take care of me. And part of that is addressing the people I work with, the people that I care about, and communicating effectively. This is worrisome. This is real. I don't know how this affects all of you, but I can imagine there's this huge range of feelings and experiences that you're having. I'm here to talk to. I'm going to leave my door open, so to speak. I'm going to free up time. If you want to share with me your concerns, if we can come together and think of things that we can do as a group, I think it'll be so much more meaningful and impactful. Can we, are there ideas and suggestions? So getting people to generate ideas about how to take care and how to address the issue, even if it's, small little gestures. So I think it's that ebb and flow between me having some self-awareness and being, kind of constantly checking in with myself. What do I need to do? How can I restore my energy? How can I feel like this is something I can manage? And then how can I address people in a meaningful and compassionate way, understanding they all bring different experiences to the table and to the workplace.
That is such a helpful answer. Thank you so much, Estelle. And it leads me a little bit back to the beginning of the conversation. As I mentioned, especially the first few days of this war happening in Ukraine,
Mm.
I myself, a lot of the anxiety was coming from this feeling of being the guilt. Am I doing enough? Am I there enough for my team?
Yeah.
Am I there enough for my friends in Ukraine and the organizations that work that are connected to Ukraine, and all this guilt? And I wonder if you have any perspective on how do we deal with guilt
Mm.
in such situations? Like generally, what do we do to deal with guilt?
Right? Guilt usually comes from inactivity, right? So, you have to be still to feel guilty. If you're moving and you're doing something, whatever that something is, it's less likely for you to experience guilt. So, I think if you use guilt as a information base to say, okay, so if I'm feeling guilty because I feel like I'm not doing enough, is there something else I can do? Even if it's small. And again, think about these gestures that influence others. So it's not just me donating time or me, doing some gesture. And I think too, there was an article some time ago about some Harvard young people who created an app when the war first started about people being able to jump in and offer their homes for Ukrainian refugees, to offer to look after pets, and it became this place where people could go to connect. And so this is the kind of thinking that is not just I can contribute this one thing, but how can my influence affect more people? How can I broaden the reach that I have? So it's not necessarily doing more, but thinking bigger, thinking that if I do this, this influences other people, which influences other people. And so think of that broad area of influence, even if it's your helping people to learn how to be kind or considerate or compassionate to others. That's the kind of reach that you have that influences other people in terms of how they influence other people. So think bigger picture in those situations, and use guilt to be a launch pad as opposed to a place to stay, right? Because there is a limit at some point in the day, right, where you need to shut down and rest. And we can all feel guilty 24/7 when we stop. But if we focus on what we can do, not what we can't do, I think the guilt will become a little less intrusive, and be more of that launch pad to influence other people who will influence other people. So think of that reach, right? That ripple effect, or the domino effect, which I think is a great way to encourage more meaningful change, because it's not sort of one person specific and one person focused, but kind of enjoying people and encouraging people to reach bigger audiences.
And as you said, it's about really taking action.
Yeah.
And maybe one advice could be to take some time to create some space in which you can really sit down and ask yourself, and maybe be with a group around you, with friends, with partners, with even with your team, and try and get in peace with yourself. How much resources, with a specific situation with Ukraine, how much resources can I offer to be of help?
Mhm.
Maybe that's donating certain funds to humanitarian organizations. Maybe it's about my expertise to create an app. Maybe it's about offering my summer house to refugees to stay there while they're
Right.
right. So what is it in terms of resources? How many hours per week? What resources, if I want to be part of it and support it, can I offer to be of help? And who are other people that can help me out on, and maybe we can team up and be of help. So you're not staying in freeze and being guilty, but instead you actually proactively helping.
Absolutely. And I think, further to that, one of the things that many people struggle with is I want to help. I know what I can do, but where do I go to do that? So providing people the link to the right website or the right, charitable group, or having that easy access to the way to give. Not they often know what they want to do. They just don't know where to go to do it. Right. And so, you think of charities and donating time, as you said, donating expertise. People might say, I'm happy to do that. I have no idea where to go. So if you as a leader can even figure out where are those links and how can I make those accessible to people so they feel like they can contribute meaningfully, and move to action, from guilt to action, I can offer those opportunities. I can open up the opportunities, because that often is, it's not the what, it's how do I do this? Where do I go? So that's an easy, I think, link for a leader to provide to the people that they work with is, here's where you go. Here's the link. Here's the vehicle in which you can provide meaningful support.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Estelle. And
Mhm.
continuing on the topic, many people have been struggling the last couple of years, but now again for the past months, by all the uncertainty of, I mean, imagine people have to relocate, people are losing somebody that they love, dealing with grief, with loss. And as I understand from your background, you've been supporting many people going through such events, with 9/11, with other such traumatic events. So I wonder, for the audience out there that's directly affected, in one way or another, maybe having somebody that they know that they lost, or they lost connection with them, what would be your advice, some practical advice for them? How could they navigate and manage the the grief and loss?
I think that many people, when they've been through, I mean, there's grief in and of itself, and then there's traumatic grief, right? There's complicated grief. And I think for many of us, it's hard to imagine, people that haven't lost something, someone during the pandemic, for example. The war even adds more grief and loss um, to the picture. And grief can be, loss can be about freedom, right? So it's, sometimes it's a person that you've lost. Sometimes it's the freedom to do certain things, or the freedom to be the way you used to be, to act in it. And, if you think of COVID, for example, our need for social connection became a huge loss for people that experienced lockdowns, as an example. For people, during the war, not knowing what's happened to their relatives, not knowing what happened, makes it a very complicated grief, because you don't know if somebody's alive and okay or not. So grief takes on a very different experience than what we might call routine grief, where someone may have passed, or someone may have died in sort of more expected tragedy. I think when you look at grief and loss through this kind of experience, it becomes very complicated, very convoluted. And one of the things that happens with more traumatic loss is the need to tell the story, the need to talk about it, to say it out loud. Often people's inclination during traumatic injury is to keep it inside and not talk about it. And what I hear from people is, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. Let's just, focus on something else. And what happens is it takes on a life inside, right? It moves from your conscious mind to an internal experience. And in that internal experience, it affects you whether you realize it or not. And so things like nightmares, something called hypervigilance, where you are on guard all the time. It's one of the things that's important to understand about traumatic stress is that it's kind of like being lit up 24/7. And so our bodies have this natural reaction when there are life and death moments, to be on guard. And that's a good thing. Our senses become heightened. We're ready for anything. We're really hyper aroused and we're ready for anything. Well, that's great when it's short lived and when there's a physical threat, but when there's a psychological threat. So, for instance, in the case of the war or COVID, and not knowing how somebody is, we go into the same sense of hyperarousal that we do when we're physically threatened. The difference is it lasts, it doesn't go away. And so we become hyperaroused all the time, and we burn ourselves out as a result because our bodies weren't meant to be in that state of hyperarousal all the time. And so, what I think is important to know is that talking about it, putting it out there with a loved one, with a professional, is really critical so that it doesn't take on a life inside. And you start to move from this repressed expression. It can come out in physical ways, to a verbal expression and a conscious expression. And that is a movement that is really, really important. So taking it from a, pushing it down kind of experience to one that you articulate, the one that you express and are able to put out there, is a huge part of recovery. And so being open as a significant other, as a friend, as a professional, as a leader, is really important to help people tell that story so they can not live with it inside, but kind of project that outward. Understanding, I would also say, from a grief and loss perspective, understanding the impact on people, in that it isn't business as usual. Well, people die and people, lose people every day. The circumstances in which someone passes, or where we don't know their whereabouts, can be really, really traumatic because we really don't know what we're dealing with. And so the emotions don't have a place to rest, so to speak. They're kind of moving and changing all the time. You're looking for information to confirm your worst fears. And you're in this suspended state of grief because you might not know what happened to a loved one. You might not know their future or their destiny. And so you stay in this suspended sense of grief. And it can have a very different effect on people, as I said, even physically, than when you know what happened and you're able to kind of understand it and move forward in some way. So know that these things can live and have a life of their own inside. And you not thinking about it during the day doesn't mean it's not impacting you in some really critical way.
That is such an important note for us to try and be more aware about these things, but also on the other side, if we are not as directly impacted. And by the way, some people might be feeling hyper aroused, not being directly affected, but just being more sensitive toward what's happening and so
Right.
on. So it doesn't mean that that's the only time that happens, but
Yeah.
for us to also be there for others and just say, hey guys, like be open to listen. And
Mhm.
maybe if you can share any advice on how can we invite people that we care about to share, because that's also a struggle I find. When you are in such a situation, you kind of don't want to bother others. You kind of feel like,
Mhm.
I'll just deal with it myself. I'm so low, I don't want to. So how can we invite, in a caring way, people who are dealing with such traumatic feelings to open up and to share?
Right. So a couple of things. I mean, first, I want to comment on something you said, Stoyan, about even people who aren't directly affected. So there's something called vicarious trauma, and that happens when you're exposed not directly, but so if you imagine first responders, for instance, can have vicarious trauma when they are repeatedly subject to traumatic events, and people that during the war, for instance, flood themselves with news. Some people can handle that, and other people, they become almost as if it's happening to them. So they become flooded with information. They go into the same behaviors and the same states. I've seen it quite often with first responders. I've seen it with people that have witnessed trauma, people that, again, sort of overindulge in news and information. So important to be aware of your own experience, as you said, when you open up that door to talk to someone, to support someone, to understand yourself. Am I starting to feel, unnerved? Am I starting to react very much like the people I'm supporting? Because if I am, I might have to shut some of this down. So be aware of your own consumption of news, be aware of and it's okay to say, I need to shut this down because I'm feeling overwhelmed. And I'm not going to be able to help people or support others if I'm overwhelmed. So we go back to the point that we made at the beginning of the session today, which is know yourself, know when you're at your limit, because you're not helping anybody if you're pretending, but inside you're feeling overwhelmed. Know when you need to say, time for me to press pause, to take a break, to do some self-care, to kind of go away and restore so I can come back in a re-energized way. That's number one. Number two, I think, is, you'd be surprised what opening that door to say, I'm here. If you feel the need to talk, I can help you with resources. If you're struggling, I can help you connect to people that you can talk with. I think the recommendation to shut down things that only serve to immobilize you. And again, I would say the consumption of news can be an immobilizing thing at times. Sometimes it's really helpful to inform yourself. As you said, the media can be at times, kind of precarious, and it can present things in ways that may not be truthful, that may be inflamed in a lot of ways, and really serve to just ignite some of our own fears. So constantly asking the question, is this helpful or hurtful? And I, as a leader, as a friend, as a partner, as a coworker, can open up that conversation to say, how are you doing with this? How's it affecting you? Who do you have in your life to support you? Who do you talk to? Spreading information about good self-care and support, telling people what resources are available. Those are different ways to help. And to normalize and validate what that person may be experiencing. So often when we go through trauma, we feel alone, right? And the thing about COVID and the war is you're not alone. This is not an individual experience. This is a global experience and a global reaction. And there's a good and bad to that, right? The bad is it's overwhelming because it's so big and vast. But the good is that you're not alone in this. You're not the only person feeling this. And so one of the things that I think has happened through the pandemic, and I would say even more so through the war, is that the need for mental health support, for recognizing the importance of mental health as a valid health issue and not just a weakness of will, which is how people used to regard mental health, has, I would say, reduced the stigma. It's still very present, but it is nowhere near what it used to be 5 years ago. I've seen those numbers, in my opinion, come down. I don't know if there's any research to validate that, but I've seen those numbers come down, where people are more willing to talk about it, more willing to identify, I need help. And I think that global experience of loss, the global experience of fear and anxiety, has really opened up the conversation, where it's a much more acceptable thing to raise. And I think if you look at psychotherapists and psychologists and social workers, their caseloads are overwhelmed. So the proof is in the pudding. People are reaching out more, people are identifying more, and that's really what we want. We want people to say, I'm feeling this way, and know that they're not alone, and know that there's resources there for them.
So would you recommend to leaders listening to this podcast, executives having their teams, to actually try and see if they can pay even more attention to the emotional and mental well-being of themselves, but also of their teams, as opposed to where we were like 2 years ago? Would you say that the numbers are actually increasing and raising in terms of the need and demand of mental health? What can we do as leaders to be there for ourselves and for our people?
So I think, absolutely what you're saying is that it's pressing. It's a much more pressing issue. Before, maybe people could hide it and kind of, sweep it under the carpet and show up at work looking like everything's all great. We're less able to fake it now. And that's a good thing in some ways, because as I said, authentic leadership to me is a critical component of engaging in a caring way, is showing up authentically. If I show up like none of this affects me, trust me, people aren't going to come to you and say, I need help, or I feel, that I'm struggling. They will say, I would never share that with him or with her. And so showing up authentically and even engaging with people in a way that says, I'm affected by this. This affects me in this way. So you being a role model for showing your human side, for showing the side of you that is impacted by this, not the side of you that is able to sail through any kind of adversity. That's not the leadership that we need today. The leadership that we need is someone that rolls up his sleeves and says, I'm in it with you. I feel this too. And I know what resources are there. And I know that we all need to come together in some way and join forces and figure out what we can do together and how we can address these issues together, and how I as a leader can help support you, because I'm feeling it too. Those are the leaders that I think people gravitate towards, people relate to, not people that say, no big deal. I've heard, when you think of the pandemic and people starting to come back to work now. So certainly in Canada, we've gone through a number of lockdowns and restrictions, and people have gone to virtual work in large numbers. And so now is the time when the doors are opening again for people to go back to work. And I've heard so many employees say, leadership has said, as in such a date, you're coming back to work. No big deal, right? Things are just going to resume, and maybe you'll work 3 days, then 4 days, then 5 days, but you're all coming back, and here's the game plan. And very little recognition of the emotional state that people have gone through during, just to take the pandemic, during the pandemic. And so all of the changes that needed to occur during the pandemic to remove themselves from work, to work in an isolated fashion, and then to come back when they've kind of gotten comfortable and cozy and have this safety of how they work from home. And so the lack of recognition of the emotional changes that occur has, I think, produced some real failures in terms of encouraging people to come back. And there's this great, what are they calling it? This great departure now of people saying, I'm not doing this. Employees just putting up their hands and saying, if anything I've learned from this experience, from the war, from COVID, the thing that I've learned is I scrape off what's not important and I focus on what's really important to me now. And maybe I didn't do that before COVID. Maybe I didn't even think of that 3 years ago, but I'm thinking of it now. And these, traumatic events really teach us to focus on what is meaningful and important in our lives. And if you as a leader don't work with me on that and don't recognize the impact to my mental well-being, you're going to lose me, and you're going to lose a very skilled workforce. So I've heard this conversation over and over and over again. So I would say authentic leadership, realistic leaders that when you cut them, they bleed also, are the people that employees identify with. They don't identify with the guy that sits up in a throne somewhere in this real hierarchical environment that isn't touched or affected by these global scenarios. So So take off that hat, come down to the real world, identify with your own concerns, fears, anxieties, and relate to people from that place. You can still be a leader, you can still be the one that connects the dots and helps people get through it, but you're not going to do that from a place of detachment and distance.
And let's stay here for a minute.
Mm.
The would you recommend maybe more conscious way of making this transition? Um, we've been working from home. Many large organizations were remote 100% or
Mhm.
for the most part. And now, as you said, let's go back to the office, right?
Mhm.
Would you recommend a more consciously designed program? And in what way or shape or form? I think many leaders or organizations are struggling right now to figure out, we do want people to get back to the office for some of the time, but how do we do that? And as you said, some of them just set the rules, and probably that's not the best way to do it.
Right.
But how do we make this transition in a conscious and mindful and caring way?
I mean, the question has to be asked, right? So I hear often from employees saying, this is what we're told, this is how it's going to work. And they will tell me behind closed doors, I'm looking for another job. And what I'm looking for is this, a hybrid model or virtual package, or some other way of working. And I don't for a moment feel that these people, even though they get to walk their dog at 12 o'clock, or make their own lunch in their own kitchen, are any less productive. In fact, what they tell me is they're more productive because there's no travel time. There's no, and it's for those people, right? So I think as a leader to ask the question, what works for you? How can I accommodate you? It doesn't mean you're going to accommodate them 100%, but it means you're receptive to having the conversation. So the more conversations you have, what works for you guys and what makes you feel most engaged? And if somebody says, I want to work 100% virtually, ask the question. So what about your social needs for connection? What about team spirit? How do we, if everyone's virtual, what will be the ways that you all want to connect with each other that facilitates that collaborative team approach? Ask those questions. Don't assume you know the answers, because our way of thinking is pre-COVID. We get team spirit. We feel this collaboration when we all sit in a room together. And maybe that's still true to an extent, but it may not be all of it. We've learned to adapt through COVID, and we've learned to engage virtually. A lot of us have learned the nuances of engaging virtually. So ask the question as a leader, what makes your work-life balance really manageable? What brings you a better sense of connection and engagement at work? What do I need to do as a leader? What do you want me to know about your work environment or about your way of working that brings out the best in you? And I promise you, those questions will go a tremendous length with employees who feel like they're forced to do certain things right now, forced to come back, forced to re-engage. And so what used to happen, I think, I feel alone and left out, and I'm working in my, I call it the same four wall syndrome, right? So I'm looking at these four walls day in and day out. I can't stand it anymore. For some people, and for other people, I love working from home. I'm loving this. And so I'm going to figure out a way to feel more connected to my teammates. And I'll work with you on that if I get to work more from home. So maybe it's having 2 days a month or 1 day a week that everybody comes in at the same time, or you rotate. Who knows? I mean, there's all kinds of creative ways to do this, but asking the question is where you get the biggest bang for your buck, because people will feel heard and listened to and appreciated. And that mass exodus won't happen to the same extent because they'll feel like their leaders care about what's important to them.
This is so good. This is so good. Having the individual approach and having these conversations and and really the individual approach towards understanding people different.
Yeah.
People have different preferences, and of course, as leaders, part of our responsibility is to make sure that we have results, we have productivity, things are getting done in the most effective way. That's part of it. But then the other very important part is the happiness and the well-being of the people, and
Right.
it includes a lot of factors. Sometimes, as you said, they might be subconscious. They might be, hey, I'm good working from home, but then it might affect their social life and the communication, the culture of the company. So having these individual conversations, including people to be part of this process of designing their um, their workplace. Do I work from home? How often? Um, the other thing is the timing. Is the 9 to 5 kind of model
Right.
something that is still of like, and I'm actually wondering, this is going to be the last question for today, is where do you see the future of work when it comes to in-person, remote, hybrid? Where do you see we are leaning towards? Let's say 5, 10 years time frame. Where are we going? What would be the most desired workspaces in this period?
I mean, I hear this story all the time. People are saying, hey, I can now work from Mexico. I can work from, you know, anywhere I want. I'm going to go to Italy and work from there for a while. Then I'm going to travel. I hear this all the time. And so the freedom to work from different places obviously is offered through remote work. Does it mean that it's going to be 100% remote? I don't think so, because we're social beings. And one of the things we learned from COVID is that social isolation, we're not meant to be raised on an island by ourselves somewhere, connecting with people virtually 100% of the time. There is an energy that happens when you come face to face with someone in the same room. And I think we'd all agree to that. The question is, does work mean you need to be in the same room face to face? And I would suggest it doesn't. So I think the future is flexible, agile work environments. It's knowing and understanding you yourself. Where do you get your energy from? And how do you get empowered? And how do you get inspired? And trying to have a blend for people that they can sort of say, I'm going to have some of the time here and some of the time there, and really supporting people to understand what their own social needs are through work and where they perform best and how. So what's the right blend? And I think flexibility as a workplace offering is going to be the order of the day. So, we moved from pay and the structure of work to benefits for the newer generations. They were really interested in benefits. And I think the next level is flexibility. How do people want to work in that hybrid world? Do they choose to work 5 days a week virtual? Do they choose to have a blend? Do they want the physical face-to-face contact? I think being a flexible work environment is going to be the new attraction for talent.
Estelle, thank you so much for sharing this and for literally giving us so much value in this episode. It's been fantastic having you on. I want to continue for 3 more hours. I have hundreds more questions, but I think we'll keep that for another time. Just finally, where could people find you, get in touch with you, learn more about your work, and potentially hire you even to help them support them and their teams with well-being, with mental health, with all these other beautiful things?
So my company is called Real Life Therapy. So I am Estelle Morrison, or www.reallifetherapy.ca. That's my company.
Fantastic. And maybe just to wrap up the episode, what would be your final words, your message to the audience of the leaders who care, so we can wrap up the episode?
The thing that I would say is understand your human needs as a leader. Know that you are not immune to the ravages of things that are happening in the world alongside of your business. Understand that your expertise is fantastic, but what people will relate to is more your authentic self showing up at work. That's going to be the way to build trust and engagement and inspiration, is you being a real human being with needs, not one that is a superpower, who has absolutely no qualities of vulnerability. So know that that's your strength, not your weakness.
What a great way to finish. Vulnerability is a strength. Let's
Mhm.
try and show up being more real, being more authentic. Thank you so much for everybody who
You're
joined
welcome.
us and spent an hour with us listening to episode 68 from The Leaders Who Care, which means there's 67 more episodes. Um, and you're more than welcome to check out The Leaders Who Care on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major podcast platform. Subscribe to the podcast so you can get all new episodes. Share this episode with a friend that might find it valuable, and keep leading from the heart. Keep leading with care. Have a fantastic day, everybody. Thank you so much, Estelle.
Thank you.